Houston, this is Mars Base Camp 1. Good morning from Mars orbit. It's 0800 local, Sol 50. That's MET day 322 for all you Earthlings out there. We acknowledge a good burst transmission last night. Chang passes on his thanks for the soil analysis CAL procedures. We'll be getting working on those in the morning. We're getting ready for our laser dump. And we've got a good laser lock. And marked transmission. Got a busy day ahead of us today. Jackson finished up the 3D printing of the sample collection witness plate. That'll get installed in Excursion Module 2, which he's out flying today. Getting set up for the Sol 75 first expedition to Deimos. Gomez and Sergey are working on the UAV link. Gomez is out doing an RF gimbal align, and Sergey's getting ready for today's second flight of the UAV over Basin 24-Alpha. Yesterday's flight was spectacular. Sergey said, and I quote, "If you haven't flown a drone in virtual reality while floating weightless, you ain't lived yet."
Buenas tardes, good afternoon, and welcome. How long will it take for humans to get to Mars? That's a question that I have been asking for many years in my career, and I always got the same answer, about 30 years. In 1980, 2010, the year 2000, it'll be the 2030s. It always seemed to me that the next generation, maybe my grandkids, were going to answer the hard questions. You know, in 1959, and that's just a couple of years after the beginning of the space age, there was an article in Popular Science where scientists summarized when they thought humans would be able to walk on the moon. Their estimate was the year 2000, 40 years. But then something happened. In 1961, I'll call it a defining moment. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was the first man in space, and it changed everything. A defining moment. September of 1962, President Kennedy of the United States gave his "We choose to go to the moon in a decade" speech. July of 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon. 1962, 1969, 7 years, not 40. What happened? It was a vision, and it was claiming a new reality for the generation. I invite all of you to join me in a visioning exercise where we pick the next defining moment. Mars. I'm going to challenge you to break it into 3 defining moments, and the first of which starts about 10 months after all of us get to witness the successful launch of the Space Launch System rocket carrying humanity's first Mars crew. Now, I'll tell you, that crew is a crew that we know because they look like us, they feel like us. They're an international crew of the smartest, cleverest, most determined people that you would ever see. Scientists and engineers that know that they're going to find great answers. They're on the way to cislunar space. We can see the pilot. He's docking with the Mars Base Camp spacecraft. It's a spacecraft we also know as well because we've seen it being assembled around the moon. It's going to be the spacecraft that's going to safely take them to the red planet. 9 long, dark months. But we haven't gotten to the defining moment yet. For that, we're going to get together. We're going to get together because that's what people do when something big happens to us. We get together in classrooms, we get together in subways, we get together wherever we can find a screen. It may be a supermarket, we're looking for a chance to share something big. And that 9 months later, we don't know what's going to happen. In fact, by the time we see it, somewhere deep in our hearts, we know that it's already taken place. Either they were successful or they weren't. In fact, the speed of light isn't fast enough for us to tell the story of these brave astronauts who had to be completely self-sufficient on themselves and whatever we packed for them along the journey. So we wait. We watch. And then all of our screens light up, and for the first time, we see the Martian sunrise. It's seen with human eyes through the windows of the Orion spacecraft. NASA and its international partners were successful again. Can you imagine the cheering, the tears, the jubilation? The world's changed. Then let me take you forward to the second defining moment. It's about 2 years later. We've been watching this team. They're making discoveries that even they hadn't imagined at a pace that's faster than we could have expected, 10 times faster, 100 times faster than anything that we could have ever expected here on Earth. They're collecting their samples. We've seen their pictures. In 2 years, we've seen them do amazing things. They have correlated data from the Indian Mendeleev Mars spacecraft, from NASA's MAVEN spacecraft, and from the Emirates HOPE spacecraft. They have brought all that information together into an integrated picture of topology, of mineralogy, of the atmosphere of Mars for the missions to follow. We've also had the opportunity to take data from Kinesis's seismograph. And with that closed-loop system of information and data on earthquakes on Mars, they've been able to translate it back to the Earth. And for the very first time, we've got an early warning system for earthquakes here on Earth. And oh, by the way, the ISU small-sat constellation worked perfectly, and they've revolutionized the way that we capture information and communications at another planet. The team's excited. They're loading back into the Mars Base Camp spacecraft for that safe journey home. It's a 1,000-day spacecraft. Again, there are going to be challenges along the way. But we've given them the tools. Bad things will happen, but they'll work through it. And we feel confident because the very next milestone is one that we fully expected. It's that vision of those 3 orange parachutes as the Orion spacecraft drops into the Pacific Ocean safely. But that's not the defining moment. The defining moment comes a few months later when we hear that NASA and ESA have a joint press announcement and a briefing. The social media is abuzz. We don't know what it could be. Everybody crowds into the press briefing room. The excitement's palpable. And then suddenly, they announce it. A new microorganism. New life found on another planet. Now tell me, does that change everything? It changes the textbooks for sure. Does it re-energize all of the science disciplines? Does it change about the way we feel about ourselves? Does it change the way we view humanity? I would think it would certainly be another defining moment. And the last defining moment, that third defining moment, occurs just a few years later. When once again, we're all crowded around our videos, perhaps wearing our virtual reality sets, and we're watching that long, sleek carbon vehicle making its way through the wispy Martian atmosphere. They're seeing mountains, they're seeing canyons, they're seeing those lava flows that we've been talking about, and it all looks a little bit familiar, but still so alien. And once again, we hold our breaths as we watch that beautiful vehicle light its engines and land very much safely. Needless to say, the world has changed. What I would challenge you is to recognize that that's not a vision necessarily for the next generation, not for our grandkids. It's a vision for us. It's a reality that can be made real for us today because of the foundation that you have already laid. And that foundation consists of the Orion. It consists of the ESA service module. It consists of the SLS launch rocket. It consists of all the work being done on phenomenology and instruments. It consists of the data being done on data correlation, multinational collaboration. All of those pieces brought together can make that happen. Together we can take those bits and pieces of the many things that you've worked on and create a new reality. And I can guarantee you it won't be easy. In fact, I can guarantee you it will be hard. But what haven't we done that wasn't hard already? We're going to count on the grit and determination of each and every one of you to make this possible, because together it can happen. Together, we can pull together the pieces that build upon the building blocks that you've already established, and we can redefine a vision that shapes the world and a new generation. I believe in the journey to Mars. I believe that the international space community can make amazing things happen. I believe that nations working together can create new scientific discovery for the benefit of humanity. I also believe that I will be one of those people with my virtual reality glasses watching that Martian sunrise, along with all of you. And we're going to look back. We're going to look back on the beginning of the journey. We're going to look at all the trials and tribulations and the things that happened and be glad that we committed to an amazing grand vision. Thank you. So you may be asking, how? I'd like to ask two people to join me on stage, Rob Chambers and Tony Antonelli from our Advanced Programs Group at Lockheed Martin, to help share the story and how it's going to happen.
Thank you so much, Wanda, and thank all of you for joining us this evening while we talk about a vision for beginning the human exploration of the Mars system within about a decade. And I said a vision. I didn't say Lockheed Martin's vision. I didn't say the vision. What you're going to hear tonight, what Wanda and Tony and I and all of Lockheed Martin and the colleagues that we've worked with throughout the industry, what we believe, human exploration of our solar system is not something that one organization or one country can do. It has to be something that's led by nations, and we've heard this again and again from the leaders and the heads of our agencies throughout this whole week. This is not something you can do with just one country or one group, and you need the will and the skill of cultures across the planet in order to make this happen. So tonight, while we talk through this vision, we want you to think about it and how would you craft and change that, the objectives, the mission, the architecture. How would you craft it to make it your vision and your mission? So we can bring that together in a dialogue and ultimately make this our vision to explore Mars. One little bit of logistics. We're going to reserve about 15 minutes, we hope, for questions and answers, because again, we want to show you what we've come up with, but we'd rather hear what you guys have to say about it so we can begin that dialogue and that journey. So there's volunteers in our green shirts, and they've got write-ups to fill out questions. So if you have any questions, just raise a hand. Boy, I haven't even started. I hope I answer a couple of them, or maybe Tony will before you have to write them up. And then we'll get to those at the end.
All right, before we get started, how excited is the room? Did anybody get as excited about Wanda's initial speech as I did? Does anybody want to go to Mars? Does anybody want to work on a spacecraft that goes to Mars?
I'll do it. So the mission itself is simple, and hopefully by now you've heard the term Mars Base Camp. The concept is simple. Put a base camp in Mars orbit, the first orbital base camp in our solar system, and from there do a rigorous scientific exploration, not only of the surface, and we're going to talk about telerobotics and UAVs and rovers. We're going to talk about the lab that we have, 15,000 pounds, we're not in the US, 7,500 kilograms of equipment, 40,000 watts of power in a lab. That's a heck of a lab, and that's a heck of a lab in Martian orbit. So we're going to talk through those things. And the concept, the vision is scientist astronauts, the best and brightest of all of us, in Mars orbit, working for a year, answering questions that we're going to talk about here, fundamental questions about the nature of reality and who we are and are we alone, and paving the way for that subsequent landing, that beautiful lander that we looked at.
So the concept of putting humans million kilometers away from Earth for 1,000-day class missions is a daunting, bold goal. But collectively, we can do that. We can make it real. We can change the number from 30 or 40 years to 10 to 12 years by deciding that this is what we want to do collectively together as an international community, and using, as to the maximum extent possible, the technologies that already exist. In this architecture, there's no magic that you need to wait 30 or 40 years for us to develop. All of this capability exists today. We just have to decide collectively that this is where we're going. We're going to Mars. So the first one is why, and Wanda touched on this, 3 high-level science questions. Where do we come from? Where are we going? And then the big one for a couple of us personally is, are we alone? Is there life out there? So it turns out we have data from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. There's flowing water on Mars, right? There's nowhere on Earth where there's flowing water that life doesn't exist. Whether that's true or not on Mars, we can go and find out. There are other places on Mars, and the Mars 2020 rover is going to cache Martian samples. We could robotically launch those off of the surface. There's other places on Mars that probably don't harbor life today, but may have historically. Another one that we've collected data on is methane on the Martian surface. And same process. On Earth, where there's methane, there's life. Is that the source of the methane that we can detect on Mars today with our orbiting assets, or is it another source? And then the future for being in Mars orbit and having humans, scientists there, low latency, telerobotically operating the rovers instead of the 20-minute communications delay allows you to fly. So you can see a picture of a UAV. So now you can cover a lot more area in a shorter amount of time, collect data on that area, and then pinpoint locations for your next set of rovers for landing sites, and eventually a human landing site.
So let's talk about the vehicle. Now, as engine nerds, Tony and I, or at least I, could spend the next hour and a half talking about all the individual piece parts, particularly the guidance, nav, and control and the flight software. But I'm going to refrain from that. We're going to try to give you a quick overview because we've had a couple of papers that have been published, one in the AIAA space last week, a week before, and then, of course, at IAC here this week. And so you can get lots of detail out of those. But let me walk you through the architecture and the piece parts. And one of the things that Tony and I are going to reiterate, none of this is new. It all exists either currently in planned development, including Next Step. I'm going to talk about where that fits in. Or it's just mechanical engineering that we need to do. It's not new technology. So a lot of you have seen the big picture. It looks big. It looks like two of everything. It's like Noah's Ark or something. Let me talk you through that a bit. You know, when we put this together, the vehicle itself, that is, we want to use two technologies. One is solar electric propulsion, high efficiency, 2,000 second ISPs, slow, right? Not a lot of thrust behind it. And we want to pre-stage elements out in Martian orbit that we don't need to take with us with the crew itself. And so there's two pieces of that, the one you just saw there. And then the lab. The first thing you saw there was the central node in the cupola. We've built cupolas. Tony has slept in the cupola on orbit. And the central node itself, Russian derivative perhaps, Japanese derivative. The things as you move out from that are the lab and the hab. And we're going to talk more about the lab a little bit later, but we want to ship the lab out in advance as well. That's not something we need to bring with us. We don't need to tie up SLS launches and liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen reserves to push it out with the crew. So we pre-stage a couple of those elements, and what's left in cislunar orbit is what we call the Earth departure stage. And Tony, if you want to talk about the other elements, particularly the propulsion elements.
So Rob talked about solar electric propulsion. I think for some percentage of the community, that might sound like magic. It turns out we've been flying solar electric propulsion on communication satellites for over a decade. So this is not new technology, it's just a new application, and it's scaling it up to a different magnitude so we can take large payloads to Martian orbit very efficiently. And then for the crew, since we're trying to not expose them to any more dangers than the mission dictates, it's let's get out there quickly, let's get in Mars orbit, start doing our work, and then at the next opportunity to return back to Earth, let's come home quickly. And that's using liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen, which is the most efficient chemical propulsion system out there. Also not new, the SLS that will launch these elements it also uses the liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen, the same engines that have been powering the space shuttle since the early 1980s. So again, reliable technology that's super efficient for transporting folks in space. Some of the new stuff is, can we build an in-space propulsion stage that is simplified with the idea that it's higher reliability? So can we use the liquid oxygen and hydrogen to power the electrical system and the attitude control systems? And in fact, that work is being done in various industries today.
So when we get out to Martian orbit and we assemble these things together, the one piece that we haven't talked about, which is arguably the most critical, depending on who you are. If you're the astronauts, it's pretty darn critical, and it's the one that's next in NASA's hit list, and that's the habitat itself. Now, we referred to the HAB and lab, those biconics, which to our SLS colleagues looks very familiar, right? It's the Universal Stage Adapter form factor, co-manifested under Orion on SLS. But the real meat and potatoes of that long-distance deep space habitation is actually buried under the tank farm. Radiation is something we have to take very, very seriously. The background radiation of solar particles and potential solar events are very significant. And we're going to talk more. You heard some about the STEMRAD research that we're doing, and we want to fly on EM1. So buried down inside those tanks, and hydrogen is a great liquid hydrogen, a great trap for that type of radiation. So we put down inside there what we call the crew quarters, which is really the next step habitat that NASA's asked all of us to start working on and looking at concepts. And there's 5 or 6 different companies building prototypes and concepts. That's where the deep space ECLIS, environmental control and life support, lives. That's where radiation mitigation lives. And that's where the crew spends most of their waking hours when they're not in the lab, not in the Orion capsule, or in the HAB.
Okay, so Orion plays a key role throughout the architecture And this is not coincidence. It's by design to leverage all of the capabilities that Orion has just from building her to meet her existing set of requirements. There's redundant and reliable avionics architecture that's radiation hardened for deep space. There's life support systems, same mindset. Hey, humans far away from Earth, keeping them alive. So we have essentially deep space communication, guidance, navigation, and control. We've taken all of that capability that's already in Orion and applied it throughout the architecture everywhere that it was needed to avoid an entire another developmental cycle on the next elements. So Orion serves as the command and control for the Mars transfer vehicle, for the Mars base camp, and then in this picture, the excursion vehicle. So with essentially an airlock and some suit ports, Orion and an in-space propulsion stage, you can leave Mars base camp and explore both of the Martian moons. And there's low gravity bodies. The Martian moons are smaller than ours, so it's more about an excursion and an EVA or a spacewalk interacting with these moons than it is standing on a planet, standing on the surface of the moon or Mars. So it's a whole new concept for us, but Orion can do the meat of that effort.
So, this picture I like because I'm an Orion guy, and Orion is hurtling out of the picture at you. And it brings up two questions that we always get, so maybe I can answer some of the ones you guys just wrote up before we even get a chance to read them. And one is, first of all, why are you hauling a heat shield to Mars? And the question was, well, why don't you just put Orion in cislunar orbit, and then we'll have a whole different interplanetary spacecraft that'll go from the moon to Mars and do all the Mars stuff, and then come back to the moon and rendezvous with Orion, and then enter. And as Tony is wont to say, I kind of like to have my parachute with me instead of having to rendezvous with it on the way home, and that's a pretty good argument. The other is if you just do the math. So someone says, well, they ask me, why would you take Orion and the heat shield to Mars? And I said, well, we could take the heat shield off, but then you got to rendezvous with his parachute, and he doesn't want to do that. But we could pull that heat shield off. How much SLS cost is it? How much propellant is it to take that heat shield, to take Orion with you, instead of developing a new interplanetary vehicle? And it doesn't take you long to realize developing a whole new spacecraft avionics and software. Anybody in this organization, in this room that has worked avionics and software, the integration with the ground system, with the other elements, once you've worked through that and you have that as your core, you'll spend multiple SLS launches worth of fuel and propellant trying to offset the fact that you didn't want to take Orion to Mars. So that's the first question as to why would you take Orion to Mars, not the least of which you want your parachute with you. And then the other question we get is why two? Why two?
The first and easy answer is to make sure that you can stay alive. And I don't know about you, but for me, there's nothing more important than that. Everything else comes just after that. So the idea that you can use one Orion with a crew of 3 and go on an excursion to the Martian moons and still have the other crew have a safe, reliable, redundant place to weather out a storm, if you will, not necessarily a radiation event, but any kind of particular contingency. And that is true for the entire 1,000-day mission, right? Humans have never been this far away from Earth. There's a lot of protection that we get from our planet that we take for granted. And without that, having the redundancy and the reliability built into your spacecraft is critical. So
this isn't part of Mars Base Camp 28, but it is part of Mars Base Camp 28 plus 1. We don't just end in Mars orbit, and we wanted to make sure that folks had thought about the fact this is truly a base camp. The analog, we're from Colorado, so mountain climbing is big, and the analog holds, though. This is a base camp in a one-sol orbit. We're going to talk about that in a second here, from which you explore the system of Mars, and from which you ascend the summit, which in this case is descend to the surface. It's kind of an inverse analog. And so we've thought through, and this is something we want a lot of dialogue as we move forward, and we don't need to decide today exactly how that's going to look. But we wanted to make sure that the architecture closed. This whole point of all this for us is something that closes from a design standpoint, feasibility and schedule. And so a reusable, single stage to ground and back to orbit, cryo-based, refuelable, sortie-capable lander fits very tightly in with the Mars Base Camp architecture. And I bet you at IAC next year we'll talk more about the lander itself. So let's talk about the mission. I'm going to introduce the mission and how we get to Mars, and then we'll let Tony talk about the mission itself. So for the nerds out there, this is a potential energy / kinetic energy graph. For everybody else, it's here on the bottom and there on the top. So we start from Earth. As you go up, it requires either delta V added, velocity added, energy added, or as you get wet near the top, you got to get rid of it again, and vice versa coming back down. So you can see Deimos and Phobos. Deimos is on the outside, Phobos is on the inside of the two moons. And then we have our high Mars orbit. For those that have seen the YouTube version of this, sped up, it's actually kind of scary. It's you're up real high. It's a one-sol orbit, and you want to stay over the sunlit region. So you're up high over the sunlit region, and then you come hurtling in fast as you know what. Mars gets really, really big, and then it goes back again. So it'll be a very exciting daily treat to watch for the crew. And so that's our high Mars orbit. That's our Mars Base Camp orbit. It's a very efficient one from which to get global access of Mars. And that's sort of the point here. And we're going to talk more about dropping rovers and UAVs and hoppers. But it's not just an arbitrarily chosen orbit, and it's not one that's really hard to get to, like a low Mars orbit. So you kind of saw earlier, we pre-deploy with solar electric propulsion. It takes 3 years to get out there, so we're not going to force the crew to ride that, maybe just Tony. And that'll get pre-deployed out there and be waiting for us when the crew comes on their much faster 450-second ISP cryo engine, which arrives, and we dock that together. I'm a GNC controls and flight software guy, and don't believe it when they say docking is that hard. It's not actually that hard. We have to make a mystique of it within our culture, and I'll probably lose my card-carrying controls badge now for ratting them out. So we'll put that together in Mars orbit. We've been doing that for 30, 40 years now, 50 years, so that's not bad. And then we'll start the mission in actuality.
So now, from this one sol orbit, which is essentially going around Mars once per Martian day for the rest of us, and now it's conducting science from the laboratory and the cupola, the windows, down to the Martian surface, and it's loading up a crew of 3 in Orion with all the consumables you need for several weeks, docking with an excursion module, and keeping the in-space propulsion stage. And now you can go do excursions to the moon, and we'll show you more about that. Down to the moon for a week or weeks, and then back to the base camp, clean out all the trash, resupply the Orion spacecraft, and then you can do it again to the other moon.
The other thing, and Tony alluded to this, was sample return and surface exploration. Now, you know, it was funny, we were out at JPL a couple of weeks ago with Charles Wetzel and his team, and we were talking about the minimal architecture to go to Mars, and we were kind of talking the pros and cons of ours. And we talked about what really can you accomplish from a sample return perspective. And Charles brought up a very good point, which is there's really 2 different types of surface exploration that we're interested in. One is the return of the ancient record. So we talked about, I think Wanda, or maybe it was Tony, talked about, you know, the Mars 2020 rover is going to cache some samples we want to bring back. And it's caching them not in a place where we think there's life now, extant life. It's where there could have been life, and we think there should have been life, if there is life there, from long ago, but that the conditions aren't great for life now. And I was scratching my head and I said, Charles, why is that? He goes, well, look, you don't go to a a swamp to go look for a fossil. You go into the middle of the Gobi Desert to look for the fossil because it's been preserved. And I said, wow, that's actually very interesting. And those are the specimens we want to bring back and study here on Earth. And we want those to be pristine samples, untouched by humans and astronaut scientists. But then there's another set of activities we want to do on the Mars surface, and that's to look for extant life. And that's where you want to go to the swamps, right? You see all this methane. Where did the methane come from? Can we fly our UAVs through the methane and gather that data? And frankly, we're not smart enough to know even what questions to ask yet, but we know you guys know what questions to ask. And so there's two types of missions that we want to accomplish in terms of the surface. So you see here a surface return that's coming up. Whether it goes to Phobos orbit and then to Mars Base Camp or not just becomes in the details, and there's a lot of details to be worked out, but they're just mechanical and aerospace engineering details. So then we come home.
So, robotically launching samples off the surface, collecting them in an orbit similar to Phobos, and then returning to the Mars Base Camp now, collecting everything you need for the journey home, most importantly, the crew and the science, and then separating and leaving the things that you forward deployed, the laboratory and the cupola in Mars orbit, for use on for the next crew that hopefully will go all the way down to the surface of Mars, and then returning both Orion spacecraft, the in-space propulsion for redundancy, and redundant crew quarters for a safe place to live. And then it's an Orion direct re-entry. And we've looked at Orion's capabilities for supporting the 1,000-day mission and also supporting the re-entry profile back into Earth, both from a thermal protection system heating standpoint and also from a crew re-entry G loading to make sure you can survive that re-entry.
And you see here, it says direct re-entry, and we carefully lay that into the architecture. We want to preserve the ability to come back, have your parachute, and not have to rendezvous with it at 25,000 feet and falling. However, if things are going well, and if all systems are go, the concept would be to go ahead and take Orion out of that returning Earth departure stage and save that Earth departure stage, SCP it back up into cislunar orbit. Why throw away good hardware if you have it? So the concept is to ensure you always have the ability for direct entry, and then you make it an option to hold on to all that other hardware. And 99 times out of 100, knock on wood, you'll be able to save that other hardware as well. But it's sure great to know that you can go straight in if you need to.
Let me go back one and let me talk a little bit about the international elements of this, which I see and I have in my head, but I'm not sure I've communicated that to you. So the Russians have built in-space habitat modules for decades, right? The European Space Agency has built the Columbus Laboratory. The Japanese Space Agency built Kibo, both with industry partners. So the countries and the international partners, their space agencies and their industry partners have built laboratories. And certainly the United States has built a laboratory. I know the Russians have built a laboratory. In fact, I'm very fond of one of them in particular because I got to attach it to the space station. So all of these elements, the connecting nodes, Russians and the United States have built and are flying on the International Space Station, laboratories and habitation modules and crew quarters, life support systems, and emergency medical supplies, all the things you need to live and operate in deep space. As an international community, if you allow me to use the big we have built these already. And so now it's making some design changes to operate in deep space, but it's not a leap, it's not magic. That we collectively as an international community have done this, and we can do this on a journey to Mars.
So you've heard Bill Gerstenmaier, I think, say, and many of us say, Mars is hard. Lockheed has been fortunate enough to work with NASA we've landed on Mars 40 years ago, right? 1976, Viking. And we've had orbiters. We've been a partner with NASA in just about every Mars mission that America has performed. And so we know it's hard. We've had our successes and our failures. But in addition to being hard, it's also big. And I say that not really facetiously, but honestly. This is a map of the potential human landing sites that have been assessed recently and assessed in the past and are continuing to be assessed. That's a lot of terrain to consider. And that's a lot of ground truth that you'd like to get before you commit to one or more landing sites. And so part of our objective of our mission, in addition to the science and the search for life and the sample return of the ancient record and exploration of the moons, is to frankly improve our understanding and our preparation for human landing. And virtual reality is going to be key to that.
So if you'll roll the movie. So this is a video clip. Anybody that's done VR understands that 2D rendering of what you can see in VR just doesn't do it justice. But this is us in a beginning stage trying to accomplish a couple of things. First, getting folks excited about this mission to generate enough energy and enough togetherness to go and execute this. And we found this VR experience, so now you can imagine yourself in Martian orbit as a key part of energizing the community, for lack of a better phrase. We threw some zero-G objects into the VR experience. I was explaining to the team that you're missing how fun VR or zero-G is, and so let's put it into the VR. And then the next thing we did was, this will be the tool that you train the rover and UAV operators in. So I don't know if you saw, our VR operator grabbed VR goggles inside the VR experience and put them on. So this is VR inside of VR, which I'm not sure has been done before, but you just saw it. So it's not magic. We just did it. And this, in addition to getting you excited about showing you what it would feel like to fly a UAV around Mars, will eventually be the technology that we train you. I know I heard applause. I didn't see hands, but I could hear from the applause that some of you are planning on being on this mission. And so this is what the tool we will use to train you, because you'll be required to fly these UAVs around. In this particular simulation, we were highlighting the methane. So it's got a VR imager on your UAV, and it's got a visual imager. But this is where you'll train to operate from Mars Base Camp and access the global surface of Mars.
You know, one of the things we were talking to I think it was the Planetary Society guys about last week in DC, and we were talking through these concepts, and they said, you know, if you had more than one UAV or more than one rover, either localized or across the planet, how different would your operations be? Is it just you'd have 3 teams or 6 teams or 10 teams or what have you? Would you hold some in reserve, and once you've learned what it is you want to go look at, you know, it's like Star Trek, right? Send a probe down, Scotty, and you drop a rover, a UAV into that area. That type of reaction to the dynamic nature, both of what you're learning and of Mars itself. I mean, Mars is alive, and I'm not talking about DNA and microorganisms. I'm talking about it lives and breathes. Things change. Water comes and goes. The SLAs, the methane ebbs and flows. And so being able to react to all that requires your ability to react, which is our robot partners. And so, you know, from a Lockheed perspective, we've been working robotics and human spaceflight now for decades and decades. And so blending those together in a seamless fashion is the only way that we'll make significant strides in understanding Mars, and it enables us to continue that exploration at a rate 10 or 100 times faster than we otherwise would, as Wanda noted.
All right, so again, excursions to the Martian moons. I talked a little bit of how you would do it from an architecture standpoint, Orion in an excursion vehicle. I talked a little bit about how you'd do it operationally, leaving Mars Base Camp, having supplies for several weeks to be able to do these excursions. I didn't talk about it from a field geologist perspective, which is really why you're going to do these excursions. So now you're on these Martian moons, and there's theories, very different theories about how these Martian moons got formed. So you're trying to collect the key geological samples to answer the questions about how the Martian moons were formed, which is part of the bigger question of how our solar system was formed. Another aspect of this is, are there resources there? Is there accessible water on these Martian moons that humans won't go and stay anywhere for long periods of time without water? And so if there's water in the Martian moon, if you remember from that previous graph, it's a little bit up out of the gravity well. So from a resource perspective, it's much more valuable because it's easier to get to.
A lot of people have asked, what's the bizarre little feet sticking out? And those are bizarre little legs sticking out of that excursion module. We sometimes have some images of the astronauts hopping around on the moons. If you hop like that, you're probably just ejected yourself into escape velocity from the moons. These are very, very, very low gravity objects. And it's not just that we're going there to plant a flag or to scoop up some earth. We're planning to do very real hands-on science. And so it's going to require input from, frankly, across the world to figure out what's the best way to do that. We don't have experience in doing that. We have some concepts here, and those legs are to give you that support against the moons, and there's little air thrusters that are always pushing you down. The gravity's not going to hold you. If you drop a wrench from waist height, you can go catch a football game and come back. Actually, it's more like 30 seconds for a hit to ground. And so these types of concepts, when you're on rotating, you're being held in front of your workplace, it's probably more like scuba diving and not keep digging up the silt than it is moonwalking or EVAing.
And then the last point here on that picture is that's Karen there with her hands inside of a glove box. She's got one hand in the glove box, the other hand holding the microphone. So again, laboratories, microgravity, glove boxes, all this stuff exists. We collectively have built this. So some of what you see here is artist rendering. Of course, the Orion spacecraft is being built at the Kennedy Space Center today. Kate Rubins is on the space station today sequencing DNA, and this was a previous picture, but you can see Karen in space, all real things that are within our reach.
And of course, airlocks and MMUs, man maneuvering units, those have been around for decades. The little spindly legs are new, but I'm sure we can design our way through that. So I think we'd probably all agree, especially if they were around, that grandmothers are wise and that we should listen to our grandmothers. And many decades ago, my grandma said, Robbie, and you may not call me Robbie ever again, that was for Grandma, if you want to make something happen in life, you want something to become a reality, you really need three things. First, you got to have a clear vision of what it is that you want. And for us, that's why this defining a simple, clear, coherent, not real simple, but clear and coherent mission with a timeline that's compelling and aggressive, that formulates our thoughts. And then she said, the other thing, the second thing of the three you need is sort of how you're going to get there. And for that, that's the architecture. Now, it's funny, and if you looked and talked at all these different sessions throughout this conference, what you see is it's notable not because of the differences of all these different concepts, but the similarities. We're all talking about solar electric propulsion and in-space cryo and habitats and ECLIS. So the architecture has been sort of bounded, and we've taken our first crack at how we put those piece parts together. And now we can have the dialogue of that. And then she said, and then the third thing is, and she goes, and this just falls out, but a lot of people forget, human nature is once you've thought through something, you think you've solved it. And then sometimes you're less likely to actually go do it. I mean, you go look it up. That's a real situation. She goes, so a lot of times people don't go then take the tactical actions. And that's what this third section is. So we have a vision. It's achievable. We have the architecture to accomplish it. What are the steps you have to go through? And the truth is, when you lay it out, we have enough time, and there are enough missions, with 1 Orion per year and 2 SLS launches per year, which is in NASA's baseline, to accomplish the proving ground objectives that NASA's laid out and test out all the piece parts both the prototypes, the qual units, and then the actual Mars Base Camp flight units in time to do a 28 mission. And so this walks us through, and I'm not going to drag you through every line. There's even much more detailed versions of this. And we wanted to make sure it closed for this initial architecture.
This sequence is laid out, I'm not sure, it's pretty close to an annual cadence if it's not exactly an annual cadence. In addition to this is overlaid what the NASA Science Mission Directorate and what we expect the international community to do from a Mars exploration mission. Wanda mentioned the HOPE mission, which will study the Martian atmosphere. There's the InSight mission in 2018, which will land on Mars. It'll both do seismic detection, in which so far Earth is the only planet where we have seismic data, so this will allow us to get a different perspective and undoubtedly get smarter about seismic activity on Earth. It's also, InSight also has a temperature probe, so it'll get pounded down into the surface to answer the question, hey, is there thermal energy under the surface that we can take advantage of? There's the Mars 2020 rover that we talked about. There's a refreshing of the telecommunications capability from Mars orbit planned for the 22 timeframe, planned or being discussed for the 22 timeframe. And all of the capabilities that we can figure out today that we will need for the science missions of the future and the human exploration missions of the future, we can start weaving into those spacecraft today. Is the next one the cislunar or the movie? So starting off, zooming back into what we can do today. So 2018, Orion and SLS will fly deep space, human-rated spacecraft farther into space than has ever been done before. It'll go within 100 kilometers or so of the moon, so I have an opportunity to get pictures of the moon that we haven't gotten, essentially through the window of a human-rated spacecraft. And then on Exploration Mission 2 in 2021, we'll put crew in Orion, farther into deep space than has ever been, be able to see the moon up close, be able to see the Earth rise over the moon, like you've seen in famous pictures from Apollo 8 and others. And with the Exploration Upper Stage, basically the upgrade to the SLS, you'll have a co-manifested volume and mass. So the rocket SLS on Exploration Mission 2 will be able to carry Orion to deep space plus an extra payload. And so it's how do we take advantage of this extra mass and volume on every SLS mission starting with EM2. And you start by adding pressurized volume so that now Orion can dock with additional pressurized volume, and you can start doing longer and longer stays in cislunar space. You can test all of the crew procedures. You could do the telerobotic stuff down to the lunar surface. You could test out from a getting ready for the science perspective, and there's also significant lunar science that you can do there while you're accomplishing the flight test objectives. And humans can learn to live and work in deep space for longer periods of time, kind of culminating in cislunar space with like a 1-year shakedown cruise. And these are all NASA's stated flight test objectives, just building them up. These are all the things NASA wants to demonstrate in cislunar space before they're ready to commit to sending humans on this 1,000-day kind of round trip, long journey to do Mars exploration.
And of course, the takeaway from that is NASA's not just heading to Mars and leaving the rest of the planet to go worry about the moon. Our vision and our mission and our journey starts in cislunar space. So the synergies between the ultimate journey to Mars and what a lot of the international community wants to learn about the moon in between now and then is very synergistic. We'll work on the lunar outpost while the international partners work on some aspects of the landers. And so there's enormous amounts of synergies that we can make together on the way to our journey. So Tony and I had the opportunity to be at the Humans to Mars conference in DC in May, and Dava Newman was there, and we were talking through the types of things it would take to get to Mars. And she said, we talk a lot about STEM. She goes, but I usually use the term STEAM, where we've added the A, because it doesn't just take engineers and technicians and mathematicians and so forth, and management, and the business folks. It takes artists and storytellers and movie makers and authors and folks that engage with the populace. You know, even my kids actually think my job is pretty cool, which is surprising some days. But when I talk to the average person at a conference, not a self-selected set of aerospaceophiles like we are, but just an average person, they're astounded at what's going on. And so part of getting to Mars is advertising that to the public and getting into this cadence, and that we all see what the vision is and what those list of steps are, those missions that are going to get us there. And so if you put that together right and you have some good music to it, you can begin to reach out to folks like this.
So I don't think it always comes across when I stand up here and present, but I am super excited about this. I think it's just all on the inside, and I'm not sharing it on the outside. But I heard the applause when we asked about folks that want to join this journey to Mars, and I saw a bunch of hands go up. So I think, do we go to questions? Do we have time for questions?
We have many questions, more than we have time for, but if you guys can think about this as the lightning round of questions, we'll try to get through as many as we can. So the first one is from Simon Clifford, who hails all the way from Australia. Why are there rocket engines on both ends of the Earth departure stage?
Okay.
So that's a great question. I'll start with that. With the same idea to the answer of why there's two Orion. Oh, and I'm the worst at short answers. So the same idea as to Orion. You don't live through this whole journey unless you have redundant capability to get back. So it's essentially redundant capability to get home back to Earth.
Thank you. Next question is a couple of different questions from Bill Nye of the Planetary Society. Thanks for being here. First of all, why orbit first? Secondly, does the plan include privatizing the International Space Station to free up funding for 2028? And thirdly, is there an architecture for getting these component spacecraft to Mars that includes Atlas Delta, Orion, Falcon, as well as Space Launch System?
So I'll do the first and third, and I don't remember the second. Actually, now I've forgotten them all. So the reason that you orbit first is I have a background in testing, right? Flight testing, airplanes, and so you start in the middle of the envelope and then you expand your capability. So we see an orbiting mission as necessary and prudent to further humanity's capabilities to explore. And there's significant scientific value to be done from Mars orbit, and we can get there today. And so it's a combination, not unlike Apollo 8, where, hey, we can get to orbit today, so let's go do it. And, oh, by the way, we can prepare ourselves for future missions.
So the second question was, depending on the privatization of station, One of the challenges or the directions we had as we laid this out was frankly designing to cost. We could come up with an armada of Orion spacecraft that would go out to Mars, but we wouldn't be able to do that in about a decade. And you can wait until you have new technologies in nuclear thermal propulsion, which would be a much faster and higher efficiency way of getting out there, but we wouldn't be able to do it in about a decade. And so we held ourselves to two things, looking at Orion and SLS getting into production and getting into a build to print. And that's not trivial. For those of you that have worked aircraft, it's pretty normal, right? You get out of the development phase, you start building to print your spacecraft, you minimize change, and you move on to the next element. And so that's the approach we want to take with Orion and SLS. And if you do that, the only thing you really need from an ISS standpoint is for that to start to get into a continued operations phase that allows us to maybe squeeze in a couple of extra SLS launches. And so we're not dependent on that, but it would certainly help us accelerate and go faster.
And then the last one was launch vehicles. And so I talked a lot about laboratories and habitat modules and how we collectively as an international community, both government agencies and industry partners, have built all of these laboratories and habitation modules. We've also launched them into space, right? And we've done it with a variety of rockets. And while some of these elements require SLS, the whole architecture still has room for different contributions, right? We didn't have the European contribution to this into the artwork yet, the Japanese contribution, but whether it's a launch vehicle or a laboratory or a habitat, there's room in this journey to Mars for all of humanity.
Okay, we'll do a couple more, just really quick. This next one's from Anna from Guadalajara University. How will you fight radiation?
So none of these are short. Sorry, Matt. So Orion was the first spacecraft designed with radiation requirements for under consideration from the beginning. So Orion, as a design, has a radiation storm shelter for solar particle events, kind of solar storms, and then an overall design, an analysis plan, and then from Exploration Flight Test 1 that we flew in December of 14, we have actual data from that flight test to describe or to characterize the radiation environment. And so we've had the team look and say, can we fly a 1,000-day mission with crew all the way to Mars and back? And it turns out, with some assumptions of prior radiation exposure, crew gender, crew age, and then the solar activity, where you are in the solar cycle, today, as long as you put the same radiation protection that Orion has into the rest of the architecture and leverage Orion's storm shelter, that the architecture exists today to fly humans on a 1,000-day mission to Mars orbit and back and stay under the requirements levied by NASA. The problem with radiation is you're never going to be satisfied with where you're at. So while we can accomplish the mission today with the existing requirements, we will strive to do better. And in fact, some of that work is on display here at IAC.
Thanks very much. Next one comes from, actually we have a couple of different questions on this topic. One is from, apparently coming from Reddit, a subreddit on Reddit. And the second one from Carlos, from a student from a high school locally. Question is on how we envision both national and international agencies and also other companies playing a role in this initiative.
So, when you look at the piece parts, it's funny, on the one hand, we wanted to make sure we had a closed design in our architecture that we could start with and move from there. So we wanted to be minimalist in that we could pull it off, but ensure that as the international partners and commercial entities began to show interest and get involved, that we could make it a much richer experience. And so there's basic parts. I'm not saying that we would fly an empty lab, but it would sure be great to get support from science agencies and organizations from across the country on what types of science instruments should we take, and actually contributing those science instruments. There's a lot, and I think Tony alluded to this, we need a lot of consumables. Those 6 folks drink a lot of water, and they eat a lot of food, and all of that needs to be taken up. And when we talk about a water-based economy for fuel and in situ resource utilization from the moons and so forth, there's an entire space economy that has to be developed just based on consumables alone. And then finally, we've got nodes in there, right? I would love for by the time this thing is done, it looks a little bit more like a warty warthog toad thing with all these additional accoutrements that are coming out for more volume for the crew and more science experiments that could be performed. A warty wart thing.
Real quick, the parts that exist today. So the SLS, NASA's heavy lift launch vehicle has industry partners. NASA has Lockheed Martin as an industry partner for Orion, and then the European Space Agency with industry partners is already building the service module. So just within the pieces today, we have partnerships, but there's room to grow.
Last question, and I'm sorry we had so many questions we couldn't get to everybody's, but we did have a couple of people ask about this, so I wanted to ask this one. A question on how we'll deal with planetary protection, both in terms of the astronauts that will be going, also the rovers that will be going. So how do we ensure that we protect both Earth and Mars, and also ensure that the rovers that we send are sterile enough that if they're looking for signs of life, they aren't carrying life with them on the way there?
Yeah, so a really important and detailed topic, and we think, and I didn't add this into the question of why we orbit first, but that plays into that with an orbiting outpost, robotically launching samples off the surface, and part of that, of course, that picture was Karen on the International Space Station, but having a laboratory and a glove box and essentially various layers to break the chain, if you will, so that we don't contaminate Earth with anything from Mars. And then the same, we've demonstrated meeting the planetary protection requirements on all of our landers on Mars, so we will continue to do that. Some of that is in, and depending on what level you ask the question, some of that planetary protection requirements are site-specific, right? So if you're going to places that you're pretty sure life doesn't exist today and you're looking to collect the ancient record, you get a different set of requirements. So we think we can meet that today. In fact, we meet that today with InSight launching in 2018 has those requirements. And we will continue to work on the rest. But being in orbit, having a laboratory, and links to break that chain, in addition to Orion returning to Earth with all of the redundancy and reliability that you build in that spacecraft to make sure that the humans inside survive the landing and are there meeting their families back on Earth. You get all of that extra benefit in your sample return capsule by leveraging your investment in Orion.
And I'm afraid with that we're out of time, but thank you for everybody for the great questions.
Thank you.
I think it's really outstanding. It's outstanding, so how can I consult with you?
Does Tony have your contact information?
Oh, yeah, we've traded these. We're going to be